fell down in a heap. Dus lay on the rough ground. The only sign of life in him was his faint breathing. I shook him and called him. He would not open his eyes. I walked across and knocked on the door of the first cottage. I banged on the door violently. Someone moaned inside, "Ah, it is come." Someone else whispered, "You just cover your ears and sleep. It will knock for a while and go away." I banged on the door and shouted who I was and where I came from. I walked back to the car and sounded the horn. Then the door opened, and a whole family crowded out with lamps. We thought it was the usual knocking, and we wouldn't have opened if you hadn't spoken. "When was this knocking first heard?" I asked. "We can't say," said one. "The first time I heard it was when my grandfather was living. He used to say he had even seen it once or twice. It doesn't harm anyone, as far as I know. The only thing it does is bother the bullock carts passing the temple and knock on the doors at night." I said as a venture, "It is unlikely you will be troubled anymore." It proved correct. When I passed that way again months later, I was told that the bullocks passing the temple after dusk never shied now, and no knocking on the doors was heard at nights. So I felt that the old fellow had really gone away with his good wife.
Now, this is an interesting story for a couple of reasons. One is that it's just a very interesting ghost story, you might say, right? Where you're going to have a story within a story. Can we put it that way at 2B? So write that one down. We have a story within a story, right? And that for the, kind of like an onion, or for the Shrek fans in the house, a parfait, right? So you got a story within a story. And of course, you could even argue that there's a story within a story within a story, and that is to say, the philosophic understandings of what actually is being said here, right? Now, of course, setting matters. This is not a story, for example, that again, you could set in downtown New York City. It's a story that requires a certain setting. We have to be in India, where there are temples, and where there's an understanding about the notion again of, okay, what is going on with this temple and all of that kind of stuff, right? Let's work through the story starting right away. The talkative man said, right? I'm on page 299. So now already, you've got this tradition where a storyteller is telling a story, and we're going to hear that story. Put in your notes at 3A, very similar to Conrad's Heart of Darkness that you'll study later in your high school career, where you have Marlowe telling a story, very similar, right? It was some years ago that this happened. Let's go ahead and play the game right away, right? Because Narayan is playing interesting, subtle games with us. I told you, he's a genius writer. We already have, notice, it was some years ago that this happened. We have the notion of time, right? So write it down. We have the notion of time already introduced. Long time ago, and then of course within the story we're going to have 500 years before, right? So time is going to matter, right? And notice as well, but personally, I don't understand it at all. So this is a story that's right away going to be difficult to understand. Point out the irony. This is a story that we as freshman students are supposed to read and somehow understand, and the person telling the story says, "I don't understand." The suspension of disbelief obviously is going to be a big part of this. In other words, we're going to read the story and we're not going to argue whether it actually happened or not. What we're going to do rather is enjoy the story as it unfolds. Well, he's got a driver, right? And of course, he's on this trip. And Das, of course, you've got the setting on page 300, right? The surrounding country swallowed up in the night, the village streets deserted, and then all of a sudden, Das is going to swerve, and he's going to, and then we're going to have this very strange thing, right? Where somehow, what are you going to call it for your notes? Notice, it's never called a ghost in the story. But are you going to call it that? Maybe a ghost, right? Some kind of impersonation, some kind of appearance is going to happen, right? Of course, there is an old temple. I'm on page 300. Read it with me, 4 or 5 paragraphs down. Old temple on the roadside, utterly in ruins. Most portions of it were mere mounds of old brick. The walls were awry, the doors were shut to the main doorway, brambles and thickets grew over and covered the doors. It's difficult to guess with the aid of the torch alone what temple it was and to what period it belonged. The old doors were shut, I cried, and then Doss says, no, I'm telling you, I saw somebody coming out of there. Now let's go ahead and begin to work with our notion of symbolism. So write this one down in 2B. A symbol. One thing representing something else. Notice the dilapidated nature of this temple, right? Here a little bit later we're going to begin to understand this is a story about what people believe in and the ways in which the temple is no longer important within this culture. It's kind of been forgotten and dilapidated, right? Notice we have some talking to ourselves, and then on page 301 we have this bizarre moment, right? When all of a sudden you have a change, and it's not his driver Doss anymore, but of course it's this old man, this 80-year-old man who has come into his body. Of course, what happened to your voice, and the old man's got no idea what's going on, and he says it, I'm going to go back to my temple. He comments, of course, about the new cars being new chariots for him, and then he says it, I don't understand, and then, where is everybody? Who? Lots of people. And then the line at the bottom of 301, I think it's the key line of the story, so let's take a look at it. Who? Lots of people I knew are not to be seen at all sorts of new fellows everywhere, and the famous line at the bottom of 301, nobody seems to care. Not a soul comes near the temple. All sorts of people go about, but not one who cares to stop and talk. Why doesn't the king ever come this way? Again, he says it, you don't seem to know anything. Let's put it in our notes, this idea of the difference between cultures and the difference between time periods. He says, how dumb are you anyway, right? Of course, what are you talking about? Well, we're talking about a 500-year-old man who is talking about the way things used to be, and he recognizes that things have changed, right? Of course, the name here of Krishna Bhattar. By the way, you have some introductory information on 302 about Hinduism that will help you to read this story as well, right? Then down to the bottom of page 302, I cast my mind up and down the range of my historical knowledge, but there was no one by the name of Vishnu Varma. And he says it, perhaps a local chief of pre-British days, before the British had colonized India. And then he starts talking about it. What a king, right? He often visited my temple, the temple that of course he built, right? Or sent his minister for the annual festival of the temple. But then he says it again. There it is at the bottom of 302. It's an important line. But nobody cares. People are becoming less godly nowadays, I said. So the storyteller says he agrees. People don't believe in religion the way they once did. There was silence for a moment. An idea occurred to me. I can't say why. Listen to me, I said. You ought not to be here anymore. Now this idea that people don't care as much about religion is a fundamental motif of a lot of the stuff that you will read in your high school career, culminating in your senior year with a text by Matthew Arnold called Dover Beach, where he will make the argument, along with a writer named T.S. Eliot, that over time, people have become less and less interested in believing in religion and believing and honoring the past. So notice here, this story is going to play an interesting game, where you have an old man who is talking about the ways in which the past is no longer venerated, no longer understood anymore. It's like the traditions are starting to go away and no longer being appreciated and respected. Of course, we get his story. His story is that he was a good guy, but that he was killed, terribly murdered by some thieves. He gave them a fight. Now, in Hindu understandings of afterlife, you have this thing called karma, where if you live a good life, when you die, then you come back, but you come back to live a better life than the one you lived before, rewarding you in some ways for the life that you lived when you were there. On the other hand, if you live a bad life when you die, you do come back, but you often come back as something lesser. And so karma is a way to say you don't get away with nothing. In other words, whatever it is that you did in this life, you somehow pay for in the next life. Well, what kind of life did this man live? Well, he lived a good life, didn't he? And of course, he always has wanted to long to be with his wife. The beauty of this story at the end, of course, is that our storyteller is able to find a way so that Seti can come back to him and they can be reunited. And in the process of being reunited, of course, then, we don't have his spirit wandering anymore. At the very end, we had this nice little subtle bit of the story where knock on a cottage door. Oh no, it's him again. Don't think you're going to have to worry. I think I've solved your problem. Again, framing the story at the very beginning is, I can tell you what happened, but I can't tell you what it means. Let's talk about what it means at level 2 and 3. At 2A, this is a story that obviously introduces the notion of cultural differences that have to do with youth old age, right? The old people have a certain way of looking at the world. The young people often have a different way of looking at the world. And sometimes those two things don't always go together so well. What we will sometimes today understand as the generation gap. Number 2, the idea that people believe different things in different times and in different cultures. Notice in this story, we have this notion of the wandering spirit of an old man, 500 years old, around the temple. The temple, in fact, that he said that he helped build, right? Okay. So this idea of trying to respect other cultures, that's an important message here as well. And then finally, let's put this one down because it's a nice love story. Sooner or later, love in the end will always find its way back to the thing it loves, right? And in our story, he gets back with his girl. And then, of course, once he is back with his girl, back with the one he loves, then he can finally rest. At 2B, we've already said it. Setting is central. But I told you I wanted us to concentrate on conflict. So jot down. I'll just go through them. What's the central conflict for you? Is it character versus self? Internal conflict. Is it character versus another character? External conflict. Character versus nature? Character versus society or an idea? Many have postulated that this is a brilliant story because the conflict is in fact a very interesting one. It posits that notion. Nobody cares anymore. People don't care the way they once cared. So depending on which character you're talking about? Well, obviously the old man at the temple is the actual character of the story. So what is it that he's in conflict with? You could argue that he's in conflict with society. Nobody cares anymore, right? Nobody cares about the way things used to be. Taking care of the temple, keeping it clean, showing veneration. Of course, let's finish at 2B. The symbol of the temple is obviously important. It is a symbol that says what? Well, it says that people forget the most important things within a culture. And then no respect is given anymore. Here the old-timers often say about young people, they just don't care or respect anymore. They got no respect. I was asking a group of seniors recently, how about these 7th graders? And immediately several of the seniors went, oh man, there is no way they are like us. When we were that age, we showed respect. These kids, they show no respect anymore. And I pointed out how as seniors in high school, they're starting to sound like old farts already. Notice though, that seems to be the way it works, right? The younger generation often doesn't show the proper veneration or respect. And the temple serves as kind of a symbol for that. Obviously, setting is important. We wrote that one down, and you can jot down ways that setting matters in this story as well. Let's jump to level 3. And let's think a little bit about the relationship between this story and the Silko story about an old man who has to be buried correctly. Notice in both of them, understanding our appreciation of the ways of the old has to be respected. Both of those are understood in our story and compelling in our story. Of course, we could ask this question as well. What is for you your favorite text about the differences between youth and old age and the ways in which that works for you, okay? Your favorite movie where a young person has to teach an old person something or an old person has to make sure that a young person learns. There's a reason why we have traditions, and those traditions ought to be respected. Finally, at 3B, to ask the question of how can you relate to a story like this? A couple of questions. Some readers are freaked out by this story because they're like, dude, okay, I'm not interested in 500-year-old men jumping into somebody else's body of a young person and talking. This would just totally freak me out, right? Do you believe in ghosts? Do you believe in this notion? Or what are your thoughts about afterlife? Of the 3 possible answers I gave to you, right now in your life, which one do you believe and why? What is it that leads you to believe? Do you think that afterlife and the belief in afterlife is important in your life right now? Why or why not? Okay. Finally, of course, is the respect question. Can you think of a time when you showed proper respect to the old, to the traditions? You properly venerated the older traditions? Can you think about a time when you didn't? And now that you think about it, you're kind of like, man, I kind of wish that I had. I often will point out to freshmen as they begin their experience at Royal High School, one of the most important things you can do at Royal High School is to show proper respect to seniors, because they will expect you that you show that level of respect. They feel like they've earned it in the same way that 8th graders feel like they should be respected by a bunch of 5th graders, right? Well, there you go, a couple of titles. I hope that you can enjoy this analysis as well. Thank you.